In the 5th century, when the Roman world was already cracking under the weight of its own age, a new terror rose from the eastern horizon and gave that collapse a face. Not a king robed in marble ceremony, not a philosopher emperor speaking of law and order. A rider from the steppe, a warlord from a people the Romans barely understood and quickly learned to fear. His name was Attila, and in the memory of Europe, he did not remain simply a conqueror. He became something darker, an omen, a punishment of force so violent and so sudden that later chroniclers called him the Scourge of God. That title matters because it reveals how his enemies experienced him. Not as just another barbarian chief raiding the frontier, but as a disaster moving with intention. At the head of the Huns, Attila turned fear into a political weapon, mobility into empire, and instability into opportunity. For a brief but shattering moment, he made even Rome, the civilization that had once taught the world, to fear permanence, look fragile, reactive, and mortal. To understand why Attila struck Europe so deeply, we have to begin with the people who made him possible. The Huns did not appear out of nowhere, even though to many Romans they seemed to arrive almost like a myth stepped into the real world. By the late 4th century AD, they had already reached the regions near the Danube, pushing westward with a style of life and war that felt alien to the settled empires around them. Ancient writers struggled to explain them. Some barely knew where they came from. Others, unable to make sense of their speed and ferocity, wrapped them in prejudice and supernatural rumor. The transcript captures this well through the Roman and later Gothic accounts that described them in near-demonic terms. That tells us less about the true origin of the Huns than about the psychological effect they produced. People often turn enemies into monsters when ordinary political language no longer feels large enough to contain the fear. Modern theories have long suggested a possible connection between the Huns and the Xiongnu, the old nomadic confederation north of China. Whether that line can be drawn with total certainty remains debated, but the broader historical pattern is clear enough. The Huns were products of the steppe world, mobile, harsh, adaptive, and shaped by a landscape that rewarded movement over settlement, instinct over rigidity, and survival over sentiment. This matters because steppe societies were not simply poorer versions of empires. They were built on a different logic. Their children learned horses before cities, distance before walls, and war before administration. A people raised inside that world did not need roads to move. They carried movement with them. And when such a people acquired a leader capable of welding mobility into political direction, the result could be devastating for slower, heavier civilizations, convinced that frontiers and fortresses still meant safety. That was the world into which Attila was born, probably sometime between 390 and 410 AD. The exact year remains uncertain, and that uncertainty almost suits him. Even his beginning resists clean archival capture. He was the son of Mundzuk, part of the Hun royal line, and the nephew of powerful rulers like Ruga. So, from the first, he belonged not merely to the wider horde, but to its governing blood. Yet royal birth among the Huns did not mean a sheltered childhood. Steppe aristocracy raised its heirs in the same elemental disciplines that sustained the people as a whole. Riding archery command presence, hardness, memory, and the early understanding that leadership must be exercised physically before it can be exercised politically. The transcript is right to stress that Attila was trained not only for war, but for diplomacy as well. That is crucial. He did not grow into power as a simple brute. He learned early how Rome thought, how tribute worked, how embassies behaved, and how imperial weakness could be measured behind ceremonial language. When Ruga died, power passed in 434 to Attila and his brother Bleda. Co-rule was not unusual in steppe politics. It spread risk-satisfied competing branches of the family and reflected the looser political traditions of a tribal imperial system. But co-rule also carried a danger that every dynastic system knows too well. Shared power works only as long as both men believe delay serves them better than decision. In the early years, the brothers expanded Hun influence successfully. They imposed themselves on neighboring peoples, drew more tribes into dependence, and exploited Roman insecurity through treaty and threat. The peace agreement with the Eastern Roman Empire in 434 was less a gesture of stable coexistence than a tactical pause. It gave the Huns room to consolidate elsewhere, while reminding Constantinople that peace could be purchased, but never safely owned. During this period, Attila learned what successful conquerors always learn. First, an empire grows, not simply by defeating enemies, but by absorbing them into useful categories. Some tribes were crushed. Others became vassals. Others were turned into auxiliary muscle under Hun direction. This was one of the great strengths of the Hunnic system. It did not depend purely on ethnic unity. It depended on dominance. If a people could be made useful through tribute cavalry service, regional subordination, or fear they could be folded into Attila's growing power structure. That is one reason the Huns appeared to expand so quickly. The frontier did not need to be fully annexed in a Roman sense to become politically productive. It merely needed to accept that resistance was more expensive than obedience. Yet, as the transcript makes clear, the partnership between Bleda and Attila was never likely to last. Shared command tends to create a silent rivalry even when formal order still holds. One brother receives more visible glory. The other begins to feel that his ambition is being delayed inside someone else's name. The sources are murky on the precise mechanics, but the broad consensus of memory is unmistakable. Sometime around 444 to 445, Bleda died and Attila emerged as sole ruler. Whether the killing was directly orchestrated through court maneuver or simply attributed afterward to Attila's ambitions, the political effect is the same. The empire ceased to be divided at the top. And that matters because once Attila ruled alone, the Hunnic Confederation stopped behaving like a shared dynastic project and began to reflect the will of one man with very few internal restraints. At roughly the same time, another powerful image entered the tradition around Attila, the Sword of Mars, or the divine sword discovered and interpreted as a sign that heaven itself had chosen him for world rule. Whether literal belief or political theater, the symbolic value was immense. Great conquerors often need more than fear. They need inevitability. The sword gave Attila a language for that inevitability. He could now imagine his power not merely as successful force, but as sanctioned force. That is psychologically dangerous for a ruler because it turns ambition into destiny. Once a man begins reading victory as proof of election compromise, starts to feel like betrayal of something larger than policy. The transcript wisely preserves this mythic layer, because even if we cannot verify every detail, we can absolutely understand its function. It helped Attila see himself not just as king of the Huns, but as the instrument through which the world would be rearranged. His first great field of action as sole ruler was the Eastern Roman Empire. Here, Attila's method is especially revealing. He did not invade blindly at maximum scale every time the empire disappointed him. He used threat-tribute attack and negotiation in sequence. This made him far more dangerous than a simple raider. The Eastern Empire paid the Huns because paying often seemed cheaper than war. But every payment also taught Attila that pressure worked, so the price rose. Every hesitation from Constantinople became a possible pretext. Every delayed obligation could be converted into a campaign. This is one of the most important aspects of Attila's leadership. He understood that once an empire begins paying to avoid war, the avoidance itself becomes a resource to be exploited. Tribute is never stable when the recipient knows the payer is afraid. And fear there certainly was. The Huns hit hard, fast, and psychologically. Their cavalry could appear where settled armies still believed distance gave warning. Their use of mounted archery, intimidation, and devastation made them more than a tactical problem. They were a political destabilizer. Cities had to wonder not only if they could be defended, but whether defending them was even rational. This is where the later Roman image of Attila as divine punishment began to take shape. He did not merely attack the empire. He exposed the empire's growing habit of strategic exhaustion. The East could survive him better than the West because its urban density, fiscal machinery, and defensive depth were stronger. But even there, the Huns forced humiliating accommodation. They proved that Rome could still call itself Roman while behaving like a state that paid for breathing room. Yet the deeper test of Attila's career came in the West because the Western Roman Empire was already far more brittle. Here, the figure of Flavius Aetius becomes essential. Aetius knew the Huns well, had used alliances with them before, and understood steppe power better than most Roman statesmen. The relationship between Attila and the Western Empire was therefore never simple opposition from the beginning. It moved through diplomacy, utility, and shared enemies. The transcript notes the campaign against the Burgundians around 435, which is important not merely as an episode of violence, but as evidence that Attila's forces could serve Roman interests when it suited the political moment. That flexibility mattered. Attila was not driven by ideology. He was driven by expansion, leverage, prestige, and opportunity. He could be ally, threat extortionist, and destroyer sometimes in quick succession. But the center of gravity shifted when Attila began looking seriously at Gaul. Here, multiple motives converged. A succession dispute among the Franks created opportunity. Western weakness invited intervention. And then came the extraordinary episode of Honoria, sister of Emperor Valentinian III, sending Attila her ring and request. for aid in an attempt to escape an unwanted marriage. Whatever her exact intent, Attila seized on it with the opportunism of a master predator. He treated the gesture as a proposal and demanded half the Western Empire as dowry. This was not simple absurdity. It was strategic audacity. He was testing whether the empire still possessed enough self-respect and strength to refuse a claim framed with both personal and political logic. Valentinian, of course, rejected it, but rejection did not erase the opportunity. It gave Attila a fresh language with which to justify intervention. So, in 451, he moved into Gaul with one of the most formidable composite armies of the age. Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, and other allied or subordinated peoples advanced under his banner. The invasion was not just a raid, it was a bid to reorder power in the West. Cities fell, regions were devastated, panic spread ahead of him. And here again, what makes Attila so compelling historically is that he did not need to occupy every piece of land permanently to alter the political landscape. Movement itself was power. Destruction itself was leverage. The mere fact of his advance forced old enemies to cooperate. Romans and Visigoths, who might otherwise have spent their energy against one another, now had to reckon with a third force large enough to erase them both separately, if not resisted collectively. That coalition eventually met Attila on the Catalaunian Plains in one of late antiquity's most famous battles. The transcript is right to stress that this was not a clean, glorious Roman triumph. It was a brutal, indecisive, massively consequential collision. The hill in the center mattered. The fighting was savage. Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, died. Aetius held the line. Attila's classic strengths were not enough to produce the crushing victory many feared he would achieve. That fact alone altered his aura. He was not shattered, but he was stopped. And being stopped mattered because rulers of Attila's type depend partly on momentum. If the world begins to believe your advance can be arrested, every future campaign grows more expensive politically. Still, Attila did not collapse after Gaul. That is another reason he cannot be reduced to mere opportunistic terror. He regrouped, preserved order, and turned next toward Italy in 452. This campaign shows both his persistence and the growing limits of his system. He struck Aquileia, one of the great fortified cities of the north, and after a difficult siege, took and devastated it. This was vintage Attila, patient when necessary, furious in execution, willing to turn the destruction of one place into a message for the rest. But the deeper he moved into Italy, the more strategic friction mounted. Famine, disease, heat supply difficulty, and political complexity all worked against the Huns. That is one of the great truths of imperial warfare. Even the most fearsome mobile conqueror eventually runs into the simple material question of how long devastation can sustain the devastator. The famous meeting with Pope Leo I then enters the story, and it endures because it is theatrically perfect. Rome, or what remained of Roman symbolic authority, confronting the Scourge of God, not with armies, but with a bishop. Later, Christian memory naturally expanded the scene with miracle saints and divine intervention. But even stripped of those embellishments, the event remains historically revealing. Attila accepted negotiation, tribute exhaustion logistics, Eastern Roman pressure, and the diminishing profitability of continuing all weighed on him. Leo's presence mattered, but not because one sermon broke the will of a conqueror. It mattered because it gave a face to a broader set of calculations already pressing on Attila. He withdrew. That withdrawal was not total defeat, but it was not triumph either. And the world noticed the difference. By now, something subtle but important had changed. Attila was still feared, still powerful, still the ruler of a vast and unstable confederation. But the image of invincibility had dulled. Gaul had held. Italy had not been conquered fully. The West had not been broken open in the permanent way some had feared. These cracks mattered because steppe confederations held together not only through loot and military success, but through the personal prestige of the supreme leader. If that prestige weakens, the political glue begins weakening with it. And Attila, for all his power, ruled a structure that depended intensely on his individual gravity. That is a dangerous way to build an empire because it works magnificently while the central figure is alive and terrifying. It becomes brittle the moment that figure falters. Then, in 453, came the end, abrupt, almost anticlimactic, and therefore, in a strange way, perfectly suited to the inner fragility of his greatness. After marrying a young woman named Ildiko, Attila spent the night in celebration. By morning, he was dead, likely from a catastrophic hemorrhage that caused him to choke in his sleep. The transcript preserves both the standard explanation and the later suspicion, murder, poison, conspiracy, divine judgment. But the real historical weight lies in something simpler. A man who had survived campaigns, sieges, diplomacy, betrayal, and battle after battle was undone not by the Roman sword, but by the body. There is something almost brutally symbolic in that. Empires built around one extraordinary will are always more mortal than they appear. They look like storms. They often die like men. His funeral, if later accounts can be trusted in spirit, was appropriately violent and secretive. Warriors cut their faces. He was buried in layered coffins of increasing splendor. His tomb was concealed so completely that its location vanished into legend. That secrecy matters because it extends the atmosphere that surrounded him in life. Attila, even in death, was not allowed to become ordinary. His grave had to remain hidden, because hidden power was more fitting than a known monument. Yet the hiding of the body could not preserve the empire. This is where the real final judgment on Attila begins. Within a year, the confederation started coming apart. His sons fought for succession. Subjugated peoples who had feared Attila but never loved Hunnic rule saw the opening and took it. The Gepids under Ardaric rebelled. Other groups followed. At the Battle of the Nidau, Attila's heirs were defeated, and the Hunnic world that had once looked capable of dominating Europe disintegrated with startling speed. That tells us something essential. Attila had built a terrifying imperial machine, but he had not built durable institutions capable of surviving him. His empire had depth of fear, not depth of structure. Once the man was gone, the loyalties he had enforced through prestige and terror began dissolving into old tribal interests, rival ambitions, and deferred revenge. That is where I'll stop part 1, because the next movement is the deeper aftermath and legacy, how Attila's death accelerated the fragmentation of barbarian Europe, why the Nidau battle mattered more than many people realize, how Roman and Christian writers transformed him into moral symbol, what was exaggerated and what was real in the title, Scourge of God, and why. Attila remains so unforgettable, not because he built a lasting empire, but because for one generation he made even Rome feel temporary.